Hello, this is a video for the module TMM2051, my New Testament class, and we're looking at St. Paul this half term, particularly the Corinthian correspondence. And this video is video 2 for week 10, which is our final week, and we're looking at 2 Corinthians, in particular in this video at historical and geographical issues. So, to kick off, let me put the handout on the screen, and there we are. There's our handout. Forgive where it says recap and expansion from lectures 5 and 6. That was an edit that from a previous version of this handout that I should have caught. It should say week 7. And why I'm saying this is a recap and expansion from week 7 is because obviously 1st and 2nd Corinthians are part of the same body of Pauline correspondence. They're independent letters to the same church, and they're historically related to one another, and it would be and they're also in historical sequence, and so we need to think through what the relationship might be between those two texts. One of the ways in which I like to think through historical and geographical issues in relation to Paul is to think about basic reportage questions: who, what, why, when, and where. And we know the who, St. Paul. What we need to describe is the where, when, why, and to whom. We also have a sense of the to whom, which we covered in week 7. But let's think about where first. Where was Paul writing from? Well, we know that Paul was writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, and we know that Paul was in Ephesus for a while. And depending on how much weight we give to Luke's description of Paul's movements in Acts 19, we know that when Paul left Corinth, sometime after Gallio became proconsul there, that he went to Jerusalem and then wheeled back round through Asia Minor and rocked up at Ephesus and stayed there for a while. And we suspect that it was in that longer visit to Ephesus that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, though the letter that he wrote to the Corinthians that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 5, the shorter letter, he may well have written at some point en route, in a part of that journey, and so it's reasonable to suppose that some of the further correspondence, and there's further correspondence referred to in 2 Corinthians, that we know that some of the further correspondence may well have been written during this period. Ephesus isn't terribly far from Corinth, and so we might easily imagine there being quite a lot of toing and froing, especially as there were major sea routes and land routes from Asia Minor to the Greek peninsula in this period. So Ephesus is a possible candidate. We also know from 2 Corinthians that Paul mentions that he boasted about the generosity of the Achaeans. Now, who are the Achaeans? To the Macedonians. Now, the Achaeans were the people who lived in the province of Achaia. Now, the province of Achaia, if you imagine Greece as being almost like two rectangles joined by a small bridge, that's a vast oversimplification. But if you imagine it being a little bit like that, Achaia is the southernmost part of Greece, and Macedonia is the northernmost part of Greece. And Paul had relationships, both according to Paul and according to Luke, up and down the east coast of Greece, covering both Macedonia and Achaia. Corinth is in Achaia. And so when Paul says that he boasted about the generosity of the Achaeans to the Macedonians, he's basically saying, when I was talking to the Thessalonians or the Bereans or whoever, I said how generous the Corinthians were. Now that boast, was it made in a period when Paul was present to that community, or was it made by letter to that community? So he could have been boasting about the Corinthians when he was present to them. He could have been boasting about the Corinthians when he was writing to them. He could have been there in person. It could have been there as a letter. Now, what that testifies to is that Paul is moving about. That Ephesus may well be his base, but he's not static there. Not terribly static there. That there's the possibility that Paul himself may have gone on pastoral visits. And what this means is it means that 2 Corinthians may well attest to Paul writing either from a different location than Ephesus, or it may well have been a letter that he composed at various locations over time. We don't know. But it means that it is possible that 2 Corinthians was written after Paul left Ephesus, perhaps from northern Greece, from Macedonia. Do we know? I'm not sure that it's possible to be terribly certain about this. But actually that possibility of 2 Corinthians might have been something that was written over time as Paul travelled between locations is something that we ought to bear in mind when we consider the question of the style of 2 Corinthians, and we'll come to that later. So let's think about when. When did Paul write? So I'll move that to the top of the screen. Well, we dated 1 Corinthians in a period between an earliest date of AD 53 and an absolute latest date of 57, and there was a date of AD 54 which we posited as a relatively safe conjecture. Now I think we can stand by that. 1 Corinthians was not the first epistle to the church by Paul. There was an earlier 0 Corinthians, as we've called it, 0 Corinthians, mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul says, "In my previous letter I wrote to you not to associate with." Yeah, and it seems to be that 0 Corinthians was a short letter of exhortation, probably written not long after Paul left Corinth. So we might imagine Paul's pattern of ministry being, you plant a church, you move elsewhere, you send them a brief letter of, shortly after you leave, you send them a brief letter of exhortation, to maintain the relationship. And then you find a base from which you can send out epistolary tentacles here and there and effectively exercise some sort of pastoral management of your communities through local leaders. But Paul doesn't abandon them. And so AD 54 for 1 Corinthians, fits nicely within that time frame. Now 2 Corinthians attests to further correspondence between Paul and Corinth. So let's think about that. 2 Corinthians 1, verses 23 to 2 verse 11, and 2 Corinthians 7, 5 to 16, both refer to the fact that Paul wrote a strongly worded disciplinary letter in lieu of what would have been a difficult visit in person, 2 Corinthians 1:23. Now beyond this, we can't speculate really very much as to the contents of the sorrowful letter. It's called the sorrowful letter. On the basis of the passages that we've mentioned above, the most that we can say of them is that Paul wrote to assure the community of his concern and to urge them to discipline somebody and to confirm that they remain subject to apostolic discipline. So there's a couple of things there. I'm still in relationship with you. I'm genuinely concerned for you. You must make sure that you do the right thing with regard to this particular infraction, and also remember, not just I am your pastor, but I am your father in the gospel. And Paul mentions this a couple of times in 1 Corinthians as well. In 1 Corinthians 4, though you have many teachers, you do not have many fathers. And so this seems to be, consistent with Paul's pattern of presentation, but there's further correspondence between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Or is there? Let's have a think about this sorrowful letter. Well, there are lots of suggestions, and scholars are really good at coming up with loads of suggestions. And actually, one of the things that we ought to take away from the sheer number of suggestions as to the sorrowful letter is that historical reconstruction isn't the same thing as history. What do I mean by that? That being able to arrange the evidence that you've got and frame the evidence that you've got into a coherent narrative, perhaps by adding other ideas or what have you, isn't the same thing as that coherent story being true. Many of these proposals about the origin of 2 Corinthians and the relationship between that and the sorrowful letter, many of them are immensely coherent, but they can't all be right. And so this ought to encourage us to a little bit of hermeneutical restraint. So, option 1, is the sorrowful letter the same thing as 1 Corinthians? Well, one of the things that we know from 1 Corinthians is that there is a definite instruction to discipline a disobedient member. This could be taken as the instruction to excommunicate in 1 Corinthians 5. So compare with 1 Corinthians 5:13, drive out the wicked person from among you. Now, I think that this is a very limited theory, at least as far as the history of interpretation goes, because the length and topical variety of 1 Corinthians isn't a short letter about how to deal with somebody who's misbehaving. It isn't also a short letter that includes, an assurance of concern and the encouragement to remember that you're a part of Paul's apostolic family. 1 Corinthians is an immensely long and varied epistle, and there may be a theological unity to it, but there isn't a topical unity to it that could be summed up under the rubric of a sorrowful letter. Firstly, it's not terribly sorrowful. So this seems like a very limited thesis. Option 2. Well, the sorrowful letter could be identified as some other no longer existing correspondence that was between 1 Corinthians, or that was written either before 1 Corinthians or between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. Well, firstly, the idea of 0 Corinthians as the sorrowful letter is unlikely. 1 Corinthians doesn't describe it as sorrowful. 1 Corinthians describes it as a letter of exhortation. I encouraged you, I warned you not to associate with immoral persons. But Paul in 1 Corinthians has to clarify that that when I wrote this, I didn't mean don't associate with immoral persons from out there in the world, otherwise you'd have to leave the world. Paul's point there illustrates that the terms in which 0 Corinthians was written must have been sufficiently general as to have required that clarification. So Paul's initial letter to the Corinthians can't be the sorrowful disciplinary letter. So what about a letter between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians? We could call that 1.5 Corinthians. I think this theory has some merits, because you can imagine a brief single topic severe and a disciplinary letter of roughly the sort of length as Philemon between 1 and 2 Corinthians that fulfills all of the sorts of descriptions in 2 Corinthians. But we don't have access to that correspondence. But that doesn't mean that the option is without warrant, because we already know that there are epistles that are referred to in 1 Corinthians that we don't have access to. You know, not everything was kept. There's a set of interesting questions there. I mean, this is just an aside, but what if we found those letters? It would be interesting to ask. Would you argue that they should be included in the canon? And we'd go from 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians will become 2 Corinthians. Then we'd have 1 Corinthians, which would be the short letter. Then we'd have 3 Corinthians, which will be the other short, sorrowful letter. And then 2 Corinthians will become 4 Corinthians. Is that something that you would go for if we found those letters? Should the canon be amended? That's an interesting theological question. You might want to consider that. But either way, it's an abstracted question because we don't have that correspondence. And it would be difficult to say, even if it did turn up, it would be difficult to say that we could be sure that it was authentic. But in any case, there's an option. The sorrowful letter was written between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. The third option, which lots of scholars have gone for, is that the sorrowful letter is to be identified with parts of 2 Corinthians itself. Now, do be aware that this theory entails the idea that 2 Corinthians was a composite document, that actually it was made up of multiple pieces of correspondence that have been edited into its current form. Now, there are lots of 20th century commentators who believe that 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 can be identified with the sorrowful letter. The theme there is actually quite conflicted, as we'll see when we look at the epistle contents. That said, most of the more recent commentaries on the Pauline epistles seem to suggest that the tide is turning against these kind of cut and paste, scissors and paste document theories, not least because actually there's very little textual evidence to support them. And so, you know, there's 3 proposals. I prefer the middle proposal. You take your pick, but you need to have a rationale for why you choose what you choose. Now, what evidence is there in favour of the idea of a composite document? Well, the evidence can't be textual, because all of our texts contain 2 Corinthians substantially intact. And so, you know, we're speculating about something that happened in that period of darkness between when the materials were written and our earliest manuscripts. And so the arguments are primarily theological and stylistic, and that doesn't mean that they're without weight. And even if they were without weight, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they were wrong. It would just mean that there's limited persuasive power. Now, the chapters are brief, so 1 Corinthians 10 to 13 is brief. They're focused upon the single issue of rivals to Paul. They are deeply emotional in their appeal. So if you are prepared to entertain the idea of a composite letter theory, and you can't rule that out, then this is possible, but it's hardly certain, and actually there's considerable doubt as to whether it's necessary. So I'll leave that there for the sorrowful letter. So let's think about when. Well, how one dates 2 Corinthians will depend upon how you answer all of these questions about the sorrowful letter. If you believe in the unity and the integrity of the epistle, and nobody seriously doubts its Pauline authorship, then it follows that 2 Corinthians was written at some point in the period AD 54 to 57, after 1 Corinthians, but in the same phase of Paul's ministry. 2 Corinthians talks about a third visit. So this section of the epistle is clearly written at a time when Paul was in control of his movements, and so he wasn't in prison. If you opt for a partition theory, 2 Corinthians is a composite document sewn together of bits and pieces of Pauline writing to the Corinthians, then the dating of the fragments of the epistle will be in this general period, but the redaction, the editing into a single document, would occur sometime later, probably decades later. Also, what weight do we give to Paul's movements in Acts 19? If we rely upon Luke's account, then this would bear upon the possible dates available to us for materials in 2 Corinthians. So let's think. Acts 19:8 has Paul teach for 3 months in the synagogues of Ephesus, followed by 2 years in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. So after sending Erastus and Timothy ahead of him into Macedonia, he followed shortly, but not immediately thereafter. So assuming that he arrived in Ephesus in AD 52, this would see him leaving Ephesus in AD 54 to 55. If we were arguing that Paul was actually physically in Macedonia, then this would date the writings to a short time after this, about 2 years after. But of course, there's a problem. The description of Paul's movements in Acts in 1 Corinthians 16 and in 2 Corinthians 1 don't quite match up. Acts 19 has Paul resolved to go to Macedonia, then Achaia, and then on by sea to Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 16 has Paul promised this route. Then 2 Corinthians 1 has Paul recount having promised the Corinthians a visit on the way to Macedonia and on the way back. So he sailed direct to Corinth, then up to Macedonia. So it's about sequence. Did Paul go to Macedonia, then to Achaia? Or did Paul go to Achaia, then to Macedonia, then to Achaia? Seems like only a minor difference. And of course, plans do change. Now, one solution would be just simply to say that between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, Paul's plans changed. Of course, that wouldn't quite resolve the problem of Acts 19. But another solution would be to think of Paul mentioning in 2 Corinthians 13 that the current epistle precedes his third visit to the community. So if this third visit is the one mentioned in Acts 20, then we might think about 2 Corinthians occurring in relation to a brief visit between Paul being in Ephesus and Paul moving around as in Acts 19 in 1 Corinthians. This could be the visit mentioned in 1 Corinthians 4 where Paul says, "Do you want me to come with a whip?" Between the founding of the community and the return visit described following 2 Corinthians. So such a visit would involve something like a week's travel by sea and needn't necessarily involve a major rupture in the Acts timeline, since Ephesus would have remained Paul's base of operations during that period. So we might think of Paul leaves Corinth, writes 0 Corinthians, goes off to Jerusalem, back through Asia Minor, lands at Ephesus, stays there for a good long while, writes 1 Corinthians, writes 1.5 Corinthians, and then at some point there's a temporary visit, a very short, brief, conflicted visit to Corinthians, to Corinth, then back to Ephesus, and then all of the movements described in Acts 19 where he travels to Macedonia via then Achaia, and then on by sea to Jerusalem. That might be one way of making sense of all of this. But this is a style of reading known as harmonization, where you take one part of the Bible and another part of the Bible and you read them in the light of one another. And theologically, that might be a very good way of making sense of the witness of different biblical authors. And in fact, putting them together in the canon is actually one of the most important reasons why we would do this. That we read scripture as a body. But historically, we might be dealing with, it might not always be sensible to do a historical harmonisation reading. Some of the differences between accounts may just have to stand as a difficult testimony to how hard it is for us to know with any certainty the particular movements of particular people. So one question that you might want to think about is, what's the weakness of this kind of harmonisation model of reading? And that's a methodological question. So let's think about why, and we're nearly at the end of this video. So in 2 Corinthians, Paul states several reasons for the correspondence. The first reason, and it's the same reason as he writes all of his epistles, is that he's attempting to be apostle for that community at a distance. This ancient writing generally was regarded as a substitution for a personal presence, and the epistles, and particularly the combination of the epistle plus an emissary, would be one of the ways in which somebody would expand their physical presence. It's the equivalent of a Zoom call, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. So Paul writes as a substitution for apostolic presence. And that's true of the New Testament generally. We can think about the apostolic witness as being testimony to the presence of Jesus, but we can also think about the writings as testimony to the witness of the apostles. And that's important. It's important for us to see that that's the case, because it suggests that there's a non-replicability about the apostolic ministry, that actually the combination of Paul as an apostle expanding his presence geographically, and also the flurry of gospel writing towards the middle and end of the 1st century. We can think of both of those being motivated ultimately by concerns that witnesses, those who had a responsibility to attest to the ministry of God in Christ, that the writings as we have them of both Gospels and epistles are written with this model of the writings being a substitute for apostolic presence. They're written with that in mind, and that's a very important theological consideration when we consider the claims of the New Testament. The claims about the New Testament as Scripture. What is it that we're claiming? But there's also this question of, well, there's instructions in regard to the disciplinary issue, and certainly there is a play in some of the disciplinary issue, an instruction that the sorrowful letter has served its purpose, and that actually the person needs to be rehabilitated. But then there's also, from chapter 9, to encourage a collection for the Jerusalem church, and there's some quite profound reflections on giving and receiving. And then finally, to dismiss the claims of the false apostles in Corinth. So those will be the reasons for the epistle. So I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for tuning in, and there'll be further videos to follow. God bless.